In Laboratory Reddit, today's story is...
After years of working hard for a promotion, I arrived at my celebration to see a banner that said, "Congratulations on 1 month of work, Lauren." My father had turned my party into a celebration for my stepsister and said that it's not always about big promotions and fancy titles. What happened next left everyone speechless. I, a 26-year-old woman, had spent years proving my worth, taking on additional projects, staying late, and making sure my work was impeccable. When my boss called me to give me the news of the promotion, I had barely processed the information when my team burst into cheers. This was a big step forward in my career, and I felt deeply proud of myself. As expected, my friends and colleagues wanted to celebrate. One of my close friends suggested we go out to dinner, and the idea quickly turned into a full-blown celebration. A restaurant was booked, people confirmed their attendance, and the plan was set. My mother and some other family members were excited for me and promised to be there. Even my father said he would come, although his response was lukewarm, to say the least. I should have noticed that something was wrong by his reaction when I told him about my promotion. Instead of congratulating me, his response was a simple, "Oh, okay." He immediately added, "Well, don't let this go to your head. Promotions don't mean anything if you can't handle all the responsibility." It wasn't the reaction I was expecting. I learned long ago that my father never really celebrated my achievements. He always found a way to minimize them or divert the conversation to someone else, usually to my 20-year-old stepsister, Lauren. Lauren had started working just a month ago, fresh out of college. She hadn't landed any big dream job or anything extraordinary. It was an entry-level position, one that didn't require any real experience, nothing remarkable, but you wouldn't have thought so by the way my father talked about it. He acted as if she had cured cancer or won a Nobel Prize. He had always put her on a pedestal, justifying her laziness and exaggerating even her most insignificant achievements. I didn't have any issues with her personally, but it was evident that my father treated her like a jewel, while I was expected to simply fend for myself. Still, I decided not to give it importance and focus on the celebration. I deserved to enjoy this moment. I spent the next few days enthusiastically preparing, choosing a nice outfit, and making sure everything was ready. My friends assured me it would be a great night. I was hoping my father would finally acknowledge my success. Finally, the day of the celebration arrived. I got ready, feeling confident and happy, and headed to the restaurant. I had invited about 20 people, friends, co-workers, family, and I was eager to see them all. Upon entering, the first thing I noticed were the decorations. There were balloons, a banner, and even a cake placed on the main table. I hadn't organized any of that. My heart softened for a moment, thinking that maybe my father had really gone to the effort of doing something special for me. Then I looked closer. The banner didn't have my name. It had Lauren's. "Congratulations on 1 month of work, Lauren." For a few seconds, I thought I was hallucinating. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. I surveyed the room, noticing that some of my colleagues were sitting uncomfortably, looking as confused as I felt. My mother seemed about to explode. And my father? He was smiling proudly, standing next to Lauren as if he had just pulled off the greatest surprise in history. I turned to my friend who had helped organize the event, and she looked absolutely furious. She whispered that she had no idea this was going to happen, that everything had been changed at the last minute. Lauren, meanwhile, looked elegant, but also somewhat unsure. It was evident that she hadn't expected so much attention, and now that she had it, she didn't quite know what to do with it. My father finally saw me standing there, still paralyzed, and smiled broadly while saying, "You made it. Isn't this great?" I thought it would be nice to celebrate both of you together, but I wanted to highlight Lauren a bit more. After all, it's the small victories that matter. Small victories. I had spent years working hard to get this promotion, and he had turned my night into a ridiculous celebration because my stepsister had survived 4 weeks in a job. I could feel my stomach twisting with rage, but I forced myself to stay calm. I wasn't going to make a scene, at least not yet. Lauren let out a nervous giggle and said something about how she wasn't expecting this, but I could tell that deep down she was enjoying it. My father continued talking about how important it was to support and encourage people at the beginning of their careers, and that it wasn't always about big promotions and fancy titles. I didn't know what to say. The sheer audacity of it all was overwhelming. People sat down hesitantly, unsure of how to react. My friends and colleagues were visibly uncomfortable. Some tried to redirect the conversation to me, asking about my promotion, congratulating me. But my father kept diverting attention to Lauren. Lauren, tell everyone about your first week. What's the most important thing you've learned so far? Oh, we should take turns sharing advice for Lauren as she starts her career. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. No one had anything to say. What could they say? Good job for showing up to work every day? The room fell into an awkward silence, with only the slight tinkling of silverware as people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Lauren tried to play along, but it was obvious that she also sensed the discomfort, the forced smiles, the half-hearted applause. It was obvious that no one cared. I sat there, watching it all unfold, waiting for my father to realize his miscalculation. But he remained completely oblivious, still insisting on the idea that Lauren's small victory was as important as my years of effort. At one point, my best friend leaned over and whispered, "This is the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen. Do you want to leave?" I was tempted. Every second that passed made it harder to stay there and pretend I was okay with what was happening. But part of me wanted to see how it all played out. I wanted to see my father's face when he finally realized that no one shared his absurd viewpoint, so I stayed. And I watched as my father's grand plan slowly crumbled under the weight of its own ridiculousness. He had expected a sincere and joyful reaction from the guests, perhaps even some enthusiastic speeches about how impressive Lauren's achievement was. But instead, there was only silence, an uncomfortable and heavy silence. People looked at each other, not knowing what to do even after he repeated his instructions several times. Some gave Lauren polite nods and a couple of weak claps, but no one was really excited. I noticed that my co-workers were debating whether they should just leave, but they were too polite to cause a scene. Even Lauren, who was initially reveling in the attention, began to shift uncomfortably in her seat. I could see the embarrassment on her face. My father, however, remained determined to make it work. He tried to start a conversation again, asking Lauren to share what she had learned in her first month on the job. She blinked and mumbled something generic about the importance of punctuality. And that teamwork was essential. Another pause, more silence. My best friend muttered under her breath, "She's literally describing the back of an employee handbook." I had to bite my cheek to keep from laughing. My father, still not getting the hint, turned to my mother and encouraged her to say a few words about Lauren's journey. My mother, who had been visibly furious the whole time, gave him a long glare before speaking. She said it was good that Lauren was adjusting to her job, but that tonight was supposed to be about me and my promotion. A promotion I had worked incredibly hard for. Then, in the most cutting tone possible, she added that real achievements deserved real recognition. The meaning behind her words couldn't have been clearer. I was surprised she stayed quiet for so long, but my colleagues were with me, and I know she didn't want to embarrass me. Unlike my father, she was a real mother. My father's face darkened for a second, but he forced a chuckle, waving a dismissive hand. He said there was no need to compare achievements, and that supporting each other was more important than personal recognition. That's when I finally lost my patience. I turned to him and calmly asked why he thought it was okay to eclipse my celebration for something as insignificant as a month in an entry-level job. He scoffed, saying I was overreacting and that I should be mature enough to share the spotlight. I reminded him that this wasn't sharing, this was appropriating. My celebration for the promotion had been planned for me. My friends, my coworkers, and my family were there to celebrate something I had worked on for years. And yet, as soon as he had the opportunity, he turned it into a ridiculous event for Lauren, acting as if we had achieved something equally important. My voice remained steady, but the irritation was evident. I told him that I had spent years proving my worth in my field, going above and beyond, earning this moment. Lauren had been showing up to work for a few weeks. That wasn't the same, no matter how much he wanted it to be. Lauren looked absolutely mortified by this point. She was smart enough to realize how absurd the situation was, and unlike my father, she wasn't determined to force things. She kept her head down, fiddling with the edge of the tablecloth. My father, however, was still clinging to his delusions. He replied that I was being selfish, that I had already had more than enough recognition, and that it wasn't a big deal to let Lauren have some attention too. That's when one of my coworkers, who had remained silent the whole time, finally spoke up. She was an older woman, someone I respected a lot, and she had no patience for nonsense. She said bluntly that no one had come to celebrate a month on the job, and it was ridiculous to pretend otherwise. My father opened his mouth to argue, but she continued. She said she had been in the workforce for decades and had never, not once, seen anyone organize a party simply for showing up to work for a month. She asked my father, "What exactly did you expect people to say? Congratulations for doing the bare minimum?" I saw my father's expression tighten at that, but she wasn't finished. She stated that in all her years, she had also never seen a father work so hard to minimize his own daughter's success as in this case. That in any normal situation, a father would be proud and want his daughter to have her moment, rather than desperately trying to divert the spotlight. Then she leaned back in her chair and added, "But hey, that's just my opinion." My father looked furious, but he couldn't say anything. The room was now completely against him, and even Lauren wasn't on his side. I turned to her and asked if she knew about this beforehand, and she quickly shook her head and said she had no idea he was going to do this. She said she thought she was just coming to celebrate my promotion, and she had never asked for any of this. I believe her. Lauren may have been spoiled, but she wasn't stupid. She knew this was all humiliating. She mumbled that she was very sorry, and then quietly excused herself to go to the bathroom. By this point, the atmosphere was so uncomfortable that people began whispering about leaving. My friends and coworkers had already endured enough of this awkward disaster, and no one was in the mood to keep pretending. My father, seeing the party crumbling, suddenly became defensive. He went from being smug to irritated in an instant, claiming that this wasn't his fault. He accused me of ruining the night by being so ungrateful and making a drama out of nothing. I had to laugh at that. I told him that his attempt to hijack my celebration had already failed miserably. No one was impressed. No one thought this was a touching moment of support. He had embarrassed himself, and then I gave him back his own words. "It's the small victories that count, right?" Well, I'd say the small victory of tonight is seeing everyone realize how ridiculous you're being. That was the final nail in the coffin. At that point, people started leaving. My friends left first, and my coworkers followed shortly after. My best friend gave me a hug before she left, murmuring that I deserved much more than this disaster. Lauren finally returned, looking even more embarrassed than before, and simply gathered her things in silence before leaving too. She didn't say a word to my father. And then finally, only my mother, my father, and I were left at the table. He looked around as if he was surprised things had turned out this way, as if he genuinely hadn't expected this to blow up in his face. My mother gave him one last look of contempt, stood up, and said she was leaving too. She turned to me and suggested we go have some drinks somewhere else, somewhere that wasn't ruined by stupidity. I instantly agreed, gathering my things. As we were leaving, my father called after me, still trying to make me the villain in all of this. He yelled that it was me who had made this uncomfortable, that I was selfish, and that I should have gone along with it. I didn't even bother to respond, because at the end of the day, it wasn't me who ruined the night. It was him. Update 1. The next morning, I woke up to a flood of messages. As expected, most were about the disaster of the previous night. Some were from my friends asking how I was doing and laughing about how painfully awkward it had all been. Others were from my coworkers, still in disbelief that my father had really tried to pass off a 1-month work anniversary as an achievement worthy of celebration. But, of course, the highlight was the messages from my father. Apparently, he had spent the whole night ruminating on his humiliation, and now, instead of reflecting on his own behavior, he had decided that it was all my fault. His first message was short and passive-aggressive. It said that I owed Lauren an apology for embarrassing her in front of everyone. I rolled my eyes so hard I almost saw my brain. Lauren wasn't embarrassed because of me. She was embarrassed because he had put her in an impossible position. He had set her up to be the center of attention for something that didn't deserve recognition. The moment she realized it, she wished the ground would swallow her. That wasn't because of me, it was entirely because of him. But my father wasn't done. His next messages were long paragraphs about family values and how I had tried to eclipse Lauren out of pettiness. That one really made me laugh out loud. I tried to eclipse her? The whole night had been planned as a celebration for my promotion. The restaurant had been booked for me. My friends and coworkers had come to celebrate me. And yet somehow I was the one trying to steal the spotlight. It was so absurd that I didn't even know where to begin responding. I ignored his messages for the time being, knowing that anything I said would only trigger an argument. But, as expected, my silence only enraged him further. An hour later, my mother called. She sounded exasperated and said that my father had been ranting all morning about my attitude. She had also been ignoring his calls and messages. She asked if I wanted to meet for coffee, and I immediately agreed. I needed to vent. When I arrived at the coffee shop, my mother was already there drinking her coffee and shaking her head. She told me that he was still convinced that I was the villain in this whole affair, and now he was saying that I had intentionally ruined the night by making a scene. I let out a sarcastic laugh. I told her that the night was ruined from the moment he decided to turn my celebration into some kind of consolation party for Lauren. I hadn't done anything more than react to what was already a disaster. She sighed and said she completely agreed with me, but that Dad would never see it that way. He had built this image of himself as the fair and supportive father who encouraged all his children equally. And now that people had called him out for how ridiculous he had been, he was struggling to justify himself. I asked if Lauren had said anything, and she shook her head. Lauren is probably just hiding, hoping to avoid the fallout. I wasn't surprised. Lauren wasn't a bad person. She could be a bit spoiled at times, but she wasn't that delusional. She had been as embarrassed as everyone else when my father tried to make her the center of attention, although she might have enjoyed it at first. Still, I was upset. I told my mother that I was tired of this pattern. Every time my father did something ridiculous, he found a way to blame me instead of simply admitting he was wrong. And now he wanted me to apologize for his own mistake. She sighed and said she didn't blame me for being frustrated. Then she took a sip of her coffee and said something that made me think. This isn't about you or Lauren. It never was. I frowned, not understanding at first. She leaned forward and explained that my father had always been like this. He had always needed to control the narrative to make himself appear as the generous, selfless father who uplifted everyone. She said that the previous night had been his moment. He had seen it as an opportunity to play the hero, to act as a supportive father who made sure no child was left behind. But the problem was that he had fabricated a situation where that wasn't even necessary. He wasn't really doing this for Lauren. He was doing it for himself. That made me stop and think. She was right. If he had really cared about Lauren's feelings, he wouldn't have thrown her into such an uncomfortable and humiliating situation. He wouldn't have forced her to perform in front of my guests, struggling to come up with something impressive to say when there was nothing impressive to share. He hadn't done it for her. He had done it for his own ego. And now that it had blown up in his face, he was desperate to rewrite the story. He couldn't bear the fact that people had seen him for what he was, that they had unmasked him. That's why he was so determined to blame me, because if I was the problem, then he wasn't. I let out a deep sigh, suddenly feeling exhausted. My mother patted my hand and told me I didn't have to respond to him right away. She said that eventually he would stop obsessing over it. But until then, there was no point in trying to reason with him. I nodded and decided she was right, but just as I was about to put my phone away, another message from my father appeared. It simply said, "I hope you're happy. You ruined your own celebration by acting like a selfish brat." I looked at it for a moment and then placed my phone face down on the table. I looked at my mother and said, "He really doesn't get it, does he?" She sighed and shook her head. "No, and he probably never will." I exhaled sharply and replied, "Then that's his problem, not mine." Update 2. I spent the rest of the day ignoring my father's messages. Every time I saw his name pop up on my phone, I felt my blood pressure rising. But instead of engaging, I focused on myself. I went for a long walk, blasted music on my headphones, and tried to clear my mind. I kept replaying my mother's words in my head, how this was never really about me or Lauren, but about him. She was right. It wasn't the first time he had done something like this. Maybe not so blatant, but he had a habit of diverting attention every time I achieved something, either by belittling it or turning it into something about someone else. I remembered my college graduation. My father had barely acknowledged it because Lauren was struggling to pass her classes at the time. He had said that I should be considerate and not make her feel bad. Then there was the time I got my first job. Instead of congratulating me, he had talked about how Lauren was still finding her path, as if my success was a threat to her. Now, I had achieved a significant promotion, something I had worked very hard for, and he had decided that Lauren, completing a month at her job, deserved the same celebration. Then, when everything exploded, I was the one to blame. I couldn't continue like this. I wasn't going to keep allowing my father to rewrite reality to make himself feel better. I wasn't going to apologize for expecting to be celebrated in my own right, so I made a decision. I was done trying to make my father see my worth. If he wanted to pretend I was the villain in this story, that was his problem. I wasn't going to waste any more energy proving myself to someone who refused to acknowledge my effort. That night, I finally responded to his messages. I told him that I wasn't going to apologize because I had nothing to apologize for. I said that he had made a fool of himself, and instead of taking responsibility, he was lashing out at me to protect his ego. I told him that if he couldn't be happy for me without turning it into something about Lauren, then maybe it would be better if he just stopped pretending he cared at all. Then I muted the chat and went to sleep. The next morning, I woke up to even more messages from my father. They were even more dramatic than before. He called me disrespectful and said I was selfish beyond belief. He said I clearly didn't care about family and that my ego had gotten too big. Mine or his. I just rolled my eyes and deleted the messages. A few hours later, I got a call from Lauren. I hesitated before answering, fearing she would take my father's side, but to my surprise, she sounded embarrassed. She said she didn't blame me for what had happened and wished that Dad had never done any of it. She admitted that she had felt humiliated when everyone awkwardly clapped for her, and that she was frustrated that our father was now turning this into an even bigger mess. I told her I appreciated her words, but I also asked her why she hadn't spoken up earlier. She sighed and said she had tried. She had told our father that she didn't want a party, but he had insisted, and now that it had failed, he was clinging to his position instead of simply admitting he was wrong. I asked if she was going to tell him to stop blaming me. She hesitated before saying that she would try, but she wasn't sure if he would listen to her. Even Lauren knew how to save face. I thanked her for calling, but deep down, I already knew it wouldn't make any difference. My father never admitted he was wrong. Later that night, my father decided to take things a step further. Since I wasn't responding to his messages, he sent a long text to the family group chat. He talked about how disappointed he was in me, how I had disrespected the family, how I had turned my back on my own sister out of pure pettiness. He painted me as a cold and heartless person who refused to celebrate others' achievements, completely ignoring the fact that this was my celebration in the first place. It was so ridiculous that I just laughed. But the best part is that no one in the family agreed with him. In fact, most ignored his message entirely. The only responses were from one of my aunts and a cousin, both sending vague, let's all calm down messages, clearly trying to stay neutral. No one came out to defend him. No one told me I was wrong because they all knew it. They all knew exactly what had happened, or at least had heard about it, and that must have driven my father crazy. I wasn't going to waste any more energy on this nonsense. And if my father wanted to keep playing the victim, then that was his problem. I no longer had to keep proving my worth to someone who refused to see me. I had spent much of my life waiting for my father to acknowledge my effort, to celebrate me in the way he celebrated Lauren, but he never would. Not because I wasn't worthy, but because he needed to keep feeding this ridiculous narrative where I was the problem and Lauren was the one who needed to be uplifted. And if that was the story he wanted to tell, then fine. I simply wouldn't be a part of it anymore. Update 3. A week later, I organized another celebration, this time as it should have been from the beginning. It wasn't anything fancy, just a nice dinner with close friends, some coworkers, and the family members who had truly supported me. My mother came, of course, and also some of my aunts and cousins, but this time there was no last-minute hijacking. No awkward forced applause, no one trying to turn the night into something it wasn't. Just me, surrounded by people who were genuinely happy for me. I hadn't invited my father or Lauren, not out of spite, but because I had finally understood something important. I didn't owe them a place in my happiness. If my father was going to keep making everything about Lauren, if he was going to keep finding ways to belittle my achievements, then why should I keep giving him the opportunity? Why should I keep allowing him to enter spaces meant to celebrate me when all he did was divert attention elsewhere? I was done. From now on, I was going to treat him like those distant relatives you barely see. If we happened to coincide at some family gathering, fine, I would be cordial. I would make small talk if necessary, but I would no longer invite him to be part of my life. He wouldn't be at my celebrations. He wouldn't be in my corner. He had made it very clear where his priorities lay, and I wasn't going to keep begging for a place on his list. I wasn't even going to have a big, dramatic conversation about it. No fights, no ultimatums, no long explanations, just a gradual, steady, and silent distancing. If he noticed, that was his problem, and if he didn't notice, even better. I felt in control of my own happiness, and as I sat there surrounded by people who truly wanted to be there for me, I knew I had made the right decision.